but we're excited that you're here with us today and decided to be a part of this discussion this morning. And today we're here to talk about high-performing inclusive work cultures. What does that mean and how do you get them, right? And first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about who's on this call and what we're doing and who we are. First of all, as many of you know, I'm Jerry Moyo, and I am the former mayor of the city of West Palm Beach. What? Bill, did you say something?
I did not.
I heard you. I am the former strong mayor of West Palm Beach. And in West Palm Beach, we have what we call a strong mayor form of government, which means that the mayor is the CEO of the city. So I was in charge of operations and 1,600 employees and $500 million budget. And I did that for 8 years until I was term limited and had to move on. What you may not know about me, but I am also Dr. Moyo. I have a PhD in education leadership and served for many years as a school district leader up in New York mainly. I tell people I'm Dr. Moyo. I'm not a medical doctor. That's my daughter. She's the medical doctor. But since I left the position of mayor, I started this company, Great Cities for All. And I really wanted to have the opportunity to share with other organizations, cities, counties, other governmental entities, some of the things I learned being mayor. And a lot of that I learned from my mistakes because it's not easy to move into a leadership position. And so we have Great Cities for All, and our real North Star in Great Cities is how can we serve you and how can we serve all of you? We named our company Great Cities for All because we want to make sure that our cities are great places to work for all people, great places to live for all people. And so today I'm really excited to be here with my friend and colleague, and we've worked together for many years, Barbara Cheeves. She is the president of Convergent Associates. And Barbara, tell us a little bit about your background.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Yes, my name is Barbara Cheeves. My company is Convergent Associates Consulting. I have been in business since 2007. My work is around mostly cultural competency and implicit bias work, and in the last 5 years, work around racial equity. Most of my clients are cities and municipalities. I see many of my clients here in the chat today. I work with many cities in South Florida. I also do national work for NeighborWorks America that works in housing around the country, and I do training for them. I'm a senior trainer for Everyday Democracy, which is an organization that works through dialogue to change around predominantly racial issues in our country. And I work as a senior associate for Racial Equity Institute, doing training around racial equity. So aside from municipalities, I've been training law enforcement for 18 years, believe it or not. I see somebody on this call that was in one of my first classes at the West Palm Beach Police Department 18 years ago. I, for a while, trained new hires for the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department. And I do some for-profit clients, and I think the most notable, which we all hear about these days, is the International Speedway Corporation. I, for the last 8 years, have done implicit bias training at 12 NASCAR tracks. Yes, NASCAR tracks. So I've done training for the city of West Palm Beach on and off for years. So Jerry and I have worked together happily while she was mayor of that city. So the work I've done most recently has been around people settling into their lives post-COVID and post some of the atrocities in our nation. So I've worked with several local organizations, having listening sessions and working with, how people get back to work in places like Great Cities, post everything we've been looking at in the past 2 months.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. So can you all see my slides? My screen sharing PowerPoint, can you all see them? Yes? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So this is a picture of when I was sworn in as mayor. I was there with my husband, and you see two of my three grandchildren hanging there around me, and Judge Barbara Pariente swearing me in. I had my hand raised, saying the words that would make me mayor of the city of West Palm Beach, thinking, what the heck did I get myself into? Oh my gosh. I became mayor in April of 2011, and it was just when we were coming off of the recession. Our property values were at the lowest they had been. They had fallen by $4 billion. Our employees had not had raises in 3 to 4 years. We had them taking furlough days. They were discouraged. They were untrusting. They didn't trust their leaders. They didn't trust their colleagues. And you know what? It was a little bit like what we're going through today, right? So there I stood thinking, how am I going to get us out of this crisis, into recovery, and on to growth? How are we going to bounce forward? So I have here a quote from Simon Sinek, and I love it. He said, "The crisis is a great revealer. It reveals the pretenders and the players," right? So the players are players. If you think about, my dad was a basketball coach. So if you think about the great basketball players, right? They were in it for the team. You know, they attended to winning as a team. They shared the ball, they took risks, and they were in it to win it, but as a team. The pretenders, and if we think about some of our leaders today, they're only concerned about how they look, right? And they hide from the ball. They're not going to grab the ball and run for it. They're going to hide from it because they're more concerned about how they're going to look throughout this. So I want you to think about, are you a player or are you a pretender? And how will you, as a player, help your organization bounce forward, right? So as I said, today we're facing three crises. We're facing COVID, we're facing an economy, and so many of our cities, our counties, our businesses are struggling with the lack of funds, and we're facing racial inequality. And you know what? Your employees are dealing with each of these as well. So I want to just tell you a story. I was talking with someone who works for a nonprofit here in the city, and he said that they had a Zoom call with their staff to talk about getting back to work. And it was all, rah, rah, let's get back to work. We're going to do this. It's going to be great. And never once did anybody check in to see how they were feeling. Never once did anybody ask them, are you ready to come back to work? Are you doing okay? How are you feeling about all of this, right? And Barbara, I bet you have some stories about that as well, right?
Absolutely. I have had, on the several chats that I've had with nonprofits in our community in the past 3 weeks, not only were people not saying, how are you doing, but in the face of, most of my conversation is going to be about the racial climate, because that's where I speak from. And, having employees of color who are struggling at home based on what they've seen on TV and experienced in their lives over the past 4 weeks or so, and not having an employer or a manager or a director even say to them, how you doing? Now, how's this affecting you? And they're suffering. I heard stories I've had people in tears on Zoom calls in front of their employees saying that nobody has asked me how I'm doing in 3.5 weeks. That's actually very sad.
Yeah. So what we have to do is to think about success and define success, and what does success look like in this new normal. And we know that there's a strong correlation between culture, strategy, and success. And one of the things that used to drive me crazy when I was running for mayor is people would stop me and say, what's your vision for the city? You know what? It's not about my vision. It's about our vision. So I encourage you as organizational leaders to think about success, but to bring in people. Have that discussion. Invite in your team to help you create what your future is going to look like, what your success is going to look like in this new normal. What's success going to look like? What does it mean to have a high-performing, inclusive work culture? Help us define that. And that's part of what we did with Barbara. When I formed, at that point, I called it a quality improvement team, but I brought in a team and said, what do we need to fix here? How do we need to move forward? But you also need to define your strategies, right? And those strategies have to include addressing issues of equity, addressing issues of transparency, making sure you have the tough conversations. But none of that can happen unless you have a high-performing work culture. Culture is critical to your success, and Peter Drucker, one of the leaders in leadership, said culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the best strategies in the world, you can work with the best consultants to devise those strategies, but if you don't have a positive work culture, you're not going to achieve that success. You're not going to achieve that new normal. And we know that a negative culture prevents strategy execution, and a positive one enables it. And also critical to that is high-performing leadership. You need high-performing leadership to get to the point of having a successful work culture. In order for humans to feel trust, in order for them to feel a part of a successful work culture, they need to feel safe. And I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about what high-performance cultures look like. First of all, everyone understands why their work matters. So if you think about the variety of people who work in your organization, I think about the people who work for me in the city, the guys who picked up the garbage, the guys who mowed the lawn, the guys who took care of the water plant. They needed to understand how critical their work was to our success. And every time I met with them, I would say to them, and those of you who have worked with me know this story, if I didn't show up for work today, nobody would care. But if the sanitation worker guy didn't show up, or if the lawn didn't get mowed at the park, or if the water didn't come out clean out of your tap, that would make a difference. So people need to know why their work matters. We also need to practice values throughout our organization. And one of our values was diversity. Another was transparency. Another was integrity. We need to continue, high-performing cultures need to continue to practice that throughout their organization and preach it. Now, all activities provide real value to the customer. That's sort of a challenging one for government because we have so many rules and regulations that sometimes don't make sense. All I can think about is like HUD and all their arcane rules and all of the work that our housing staff had to go through that might not have necessarily added value to the customer. We need to address those. We also have people's roles match up with their passion. Teams grow and flourish without dependency on their individual leaders. And bottom line results and goals are achieved as a consequence of having the other 5 characteristics in place. And I can't emphasize the values piece enough. And if you value diversity, if you value safety, I read this book recently about the levels of safety and being included. And the first level of human safety is actually being included, being at the table, right? You're there, you're included. The next level is that you want to learn as a member of the team, and you have the opportunity to learn. The third level is you feel like you contribute. And the fourth level is you feel like you can challenge the status quo. When you're at a point where you feel like you can challenge the status quo, you're at the highest level of safety in an organization. And that's so critical to have that as you're having these tough discussions as we return back to work.
Carrie, I want to jump in here for a moment.
Go ahead.
About diversity. And I want to really stress, when I started doing my work in 2006 or 7, diversity was the buzzword. And diversity is great. Diversity means who's in the organization. But it's got to go beyond diversity. And what we really need is a top-down commitment to inclusion and equity. Diversity is not enough. When I go into an organization, when I first started working with the city of West Palm Beach, actually, Jerry, my first time in was under your predecessor. When I came in, I was on diversity task force.
I recall.
And HR director at the time brought me a spreadsheet with the diversity of the city of West Palm Beach. And I handed it back and said, take it back. I want this data disaggregated. And certainly most of the diversity was in the areas that you just mentioned: Parks and Rec, Public Works, utilities. So we have to have our employees understand that they can't only be a part of the organization, but an integral part of the organization. We have to include their thoughts and ideas. We have to know that they feel equal to the people around them, and if the people on the top don't look like the people at the bottom, then you don't have an organization that represents equity. So it's extremely important that the leaders have examined and embraced not diversity, but inclusion and equitable inclusion. Yeah. So we have to not use the buzzword of diversity. And I know you mean it as inclusion. I heard you say the word inclusion, but I just wanted to intensify that for folks that are listening. Because it's one thing to have a diverse organization, but where are those players? Where are they sitting in the organization, and who's listening to them? Are you hearing their voice?
And that goes back to that, can you challenge the status quo? Do you feel safe enough and included enough in the organization to challenge the status quo, to speak out about things you're concerned about? Yeah, so important.
Exactly.
So this is a quote on the psychological safety from Tim Clark, the person who wrote the book on psychological safety. And it's the foundation of inclusion and team performance and the key to creating an innovative culture. And I want to emphasize the word innovative, because to get out of this crisis that we're in, of these crises, we are going to need to be innovative. And the most innovative cultures are those that are diverse, included, and equitable. That's where innovation comes from, and there's been a ton of research on that. So one of the things we did in West Palm Beach is we brought in the Great Place to Work organization to help us find out what our folks were thinking. And these people come in and they survey your employees, and they rate your employee engagement, and it's a trust-based survey, and it attends to the issues of credibility, fairness, and respect. Do you have credibility as a leader from the people who are working for you? Do they perceive that they are being treated fairly and respect? And is there camaraderie and pride in their work? And they assess these 5 areas, and they know that businesses that do well in these 5 areas outperform all others. And if you look at this chart, they outperform businesses in productivity, in recruitment, in retention, in customer service, in agility. Those businesses that build trust, that include people, that are respected, that show respect, that embrace camaraderie, have a better bottom line. So why not do it? So I don't know if any of you have heard Brene Brown's Netflix program. That's her newest program on Netflix. And I listened to it a couple times. And I just thought it was awesome. She says, choose courage over comfort. And this statement I thought was so amazing. Now is the time to have those difficult conversations. To not have them because you are uncomfortable is the definition of privilege.
You're
right?
speaking my language there, Jerry.
I know. And you know what? At this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
The difficult conversations are key. As I said, I've been doing this for years, but they've really been interesting the last few weeks because they've been Zoom conversations. So people aren't in the workplace anymore. You can't walk next door to somebody's cubicle. You've got 25 to 30 people on a Zoom screen. So the conversations are very different. But the difficult conversations are so important to have, and most people aren't willing to have them. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why the difficult conversations can be more difficult. Some of you may know the phrase microaggressions, and it's a phrase that gets bandied about a lot lately, but do we really know what it is? And microaggressions initially are daily and commonplace verbal comments that are made that offend marginalized groups of people. So that could be race, it could be sexual orientation, it could be gender. Examples, with a Black coworker, oh, he's so articulate. Oh, did you not expect me to be articulate? For an Asian worker, oh, they must be really good at math. You know, comments that people make that relate to somebody's race or ethnicity or sexual orientation that are just down and out offensive, and we don't always realize. One of my favorite microaggressions is I don't see color. I would kind of challenge any of you, unless of course you're a guy out there that's medically diagnosed as colorblind. I promise you see color. And I know that when people say they don't see color, what they really mean is I don't judge you by your color. I don't treat you differently by your color. But I encourage you to say that because that's what we'd rather hear. To say I don't see color means that you don't see me. So that means you don't see 60 plus years of my existence. So that's a toughie. But to the conversations, for those of you who have been in my conversations, I always start conversations with a set of agreements. Race can be very difficult to talk about. It's not something we're accustomed to. You know, I talk about race like people talk about the weather. I just assume everybody can, but I know they can't. So I start with a set of expectations. And the first one is to understand that we're all experts in our own experiences. We've all lived a life. Depending on where you've lived, where you've come from, urban or rural, northern or southern, you come with your own experiences. And we have to honor and respect those people's experiences. Most of you are here in South Florida on this call. And years ago, I started doing work in the city of Belle Glade. And I went out to work in Belle Glade. For those of you who don't know, it's who don't live here, it's a migrant worker community, farming community along Lake Okeechobee, the western part of our county. Always been underfunded, under everything except producing in agriculture. It's a great agricultural community. But I was out there doing some work, and there had actually been a hanging death out there in 2002, and I was out working with the city. And Jerry, you'll remember that young man's name was Ray Golden. And I don't know if you were here then, but the young man was Ray Golden, lived in Belle Glade, was found hanging one morning. I was out doing some work in the community, and a woman who was a city commissioner said to me, "You have no idea what you're talking about." I thought, well, I thought I did. And it turns out she was right. We were the same age, both Black women. But I hailed from New York and New Jersey, where we didn't look at race the same way. She hailed from Belle Glade. So for me to tell her how she should respond to something, how dare I? You know, so we have to honor people's experiences and because it's theirs. And the other ground rule that I'll mention that I always use is say ouch and educate. I'm fairly certain, even when I mention microaggressions, most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to go out and offend somebody today. They do it because they say things that we find offensive, but they don't even know what they said. So I ask in organizations to give people the permission to say ouch. Ouch means I found that offensive, but educate means you got to tell them why. Try to do it again. We're saying you or somebody else. So I say that to say when we have these conversations, it's really incumbent on city leadership to create a safe space for that conversation. And that space is usually best created by an outside facilitator. It's difficult for somebody within the organization to come in and set the stage. So I encourage people to really, really examine if you're giving people the freedom and the space to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's,
Okay.
could you guys please make sure you're muted? Thanks. You know, having those discussions is just, the whole microaggression thing, I've been thinking about that a lot. And many of you know I have biracial grandchildren, and there's so many things that people have said to me when I've been with them, you know, oh, are they adopted? No, they're my grandchildren. I was telling Barbara this story the other day when my youngest was a little guy in a stroller. Had him outside, and a neighbor came over, and she took one look at him, and she said, "Well, what is he?" Yeah, I was speechless and said, "Well, this is my grandson," you know, and it, those things happen, and they happen for not around race, but as you said, gender and ethnicity as well. Yeah, but how do you begin that conversation with your staff? I mean, I'm thinking of this African American who worked for the nonprofit, who nobody asked him how he was doing. You know, and I was on a Zoom call yesterday, and somebody said, her Black friends are getting tired of people asking them what they should do.
Yeah.
And I said, they should be asking them, how are they feeling?
Yeah.
What are they thinking about? What's going on with them? So I think, how do you frame that conversation, Barbara?
You just started. And as I said, I am a fan of facilitated dialogue, because I think that for some people, it is very difficult. It's hard. One of the organizations I was with yesterday was a law firm, and the leader of the firm was a white female, and she just didn't feel comfortable initiating the conversation. So I came in to initiate the conversation, and people were just wanting to talk. You know, people are feeling helpless right now. They're not quite sure what to do. We don't always say the right thing. So the say ouch and educate really has to be also giving people permission not to always say the right thing, because we're going to make mistakes. I make them myself, and I do this for a living. But starting the conversation really just starts with, as you said, how are we doing? I've been starting my conversations lately with, we're at a very interesting time in life. How are you doing right now? How are you feeling? How are you looking at it? Because we all look at TV differently. I had one guy say in a conversation the other day, these words, they aren't helping themselves by rioting. You know, so sometimes I also have to take a deep breath before I respond to people, because very often the things that people say just are inappropriate. And we also don't want to say ouch to people to the point where we shut them down. We want people to be able to say things. So very often when I hear things that are completely inappropriate, I handle those off to the side so I don't embarrass somebody in front of the entire group. But, you know, with your city, I've held these conversations within departments. I think with your cities, these conversations are easier held within departments than with the entire city.
Oh, absolutely.
People are much more accustomed to working together. You get them in a small gathering, and it's a lot easier to express your feelings in a group of up to 15 than it is in a room full of 50 or 60.
It goes back to that safety factor, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Have to feel safe, and they have to feel comfortable. And they have to know that you mean it. So here's the issue for you all that are in HR or in a city management or a mayor's role. Each and every department manager or department director, you've got to get them on the same page. Because if one of them doesn't mean it, everybody knows they don't mean it. So we have to realize that, and I always tell people, you may not completely believe in this, but for the purposes of this conversation, you're certainly going to act like you do. You can't change people's hearts and minds. You hope that you hire and retain the right people, but often you have people that just aren't on the same page with you, but you have to get them there. Because it has to be done department by department. I've worked in cities, and I can go back and tell the HR director or the city manager in a minute which department is having the issue, and it's usually the department director.
Yeah. You know, I just pulled out this quote that made me think of Martin Luther King said, "Riots are the language of the unheard."
Yep.
I love that.
Exactly.
So when
Yep.
someone says, why are they rioting?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, which is the same thing within your city with people who act out, if you will, in their job. They're not heard. We had a department, I was working with a department in one city that was a parks department with people working outside, and the person that managed them never went out there at all, lived on the inside. And that happens in several places. So you have no idea what we do. So when those people start to act out or quote unquote misbehave, they're not being heard. So look at that insurrection, if you will, in the workplace where people aren't wanting to participate for you, and look at that as the language of the unheard.
Yeah. So I think that we can open up for questions. What do you think, Barbara?
Sure.
What you're drinking. What questions do you have or comments? And I think, just speak up. We could go through chat, but that gets complicated. So what questions do you have?
Don't forget to unmute yourself. If
If you have a question.
Yeah.
I think, I hope you're seeing the connection here with the positive work culture and inclusion and equity. Because you're not having a high-performing work culture if you're not including everybody.
Jerry, I'm going to ask a question. You and I, in the not very distant past, spent several weeks with a city that I won't name, but a South Florida city, and we did several weeks of training with them.
Yeah.
And one of the most important things that I think opens the door to be able to have these uncomfortable conversations, whether they be with conversations about issues of race and equity, or about whether somebody is doing a good job or a bad job, just doing what they're supposed to do, is the foundation of trust. And so from your perspective, having been the strong mayor of the city of West Palm Beach, what was it like for you being the quote unquote boss, creating an environment where people could feel comfortable having my boss say, yes, you should all feel comfortable and we should all be able to talk, but there's that sort of unspoken, yeah, but that's my boss in place. So maybe from your perspective, what was that like for you?
Well, I'm not sure you ever get beyond that, because that's the reality of the situation. But I think one of the things that really opened up the lines of communication was just spending time with people, letting people know that I was a human being, that I wasn't always right, that I certainly had vulnerabilities. Listening, one of my strengths is I'm a good listener, and people would tell me that. And I think one of the other things that really helped was when we brought in the Great Place to Work people, and we asked people anonymously what they were thinking and how they were feeling, and we got a lot of good feedback. Some of it was hurtful. So I was crushed by some of the responses, because I thought that we had a higher level trust than we did, but it only helped us to start thinking about what we had to do to build that trust. And some of it was just very simple stuff, including people in decision making that affected their jobs. I went out to visit some of the guys that work in the field and in the water plant, and they said to me, and they said, you see that piece of equipment out there? We are never going to use it. And if our bosses had asked us whether that was a good piece of equipment before they purchased it, we would have told them not to buy it. But they didn't ask us, and there it sits, right? We also, learned that people, one of the other easy things I did, and Rebecca's on this call, so she'll laugh. Every Friday, I wrote a Friday letter. It was just a little note from me. There was no links, no pictures, just how are you doing? This is what happened this week. Kudos to this team, they accomplished this. And just, sometimes it was like 2 or 3 paragraphs and that was it. But just to make that connection and keep that connection open. But I just strongly believe that visibility and being out there and letting people get to know you as a person is so critical.
I just see Wendy's asked me to talk about some of the work I've done with law enforcement. And, I've worked with lots of different police departments. And I'm actually reading, I want to read the rest of her question as okay. I've worked with several police. I spent a lot more time probably in West Palm than a lot of others. And one of the chiefs, actually, we had a period of time where Black and Hispanic and females were not applying for promotions. They weren't sitting for the exams. So they had me go in and do some listening sessions. And I did it in affinity groups. I worked with the white females, the Black females. There were no Hispanic females at the time. But I worked with every group of people together and asked why. And a lot of the why was, why are we bothering? Because we're not getting them. We're not getting the promotions. People were exhausted. They weren't made to feel safe. They weren't made to feel included. And that was under prior administrations and prior chiefs. And these conversations are hard to have. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but I can only speak about it if I speak about it honestly, because there's been a change in that area. I mean, I literally had started working with that department since, I said 2003 was my first time in there. And I saw people that should have long been promoted that hadn't been. And very often it's because they just weren't bothering to sit for the test because they didn't think they didn't think they'd get the job. What else is it going to take? And it starts even with the hiring process. Who are we bringing in? I saw a wonderful ad the other day for West Palm Beach Police that they're actually looking to increase the diversity of the police department. I'm going to send that out far and wide. And that's in lots of cities. There's issues there around sitting for the test, around getting into the school. It costs a lot to go to fire school and police academy.
Well, one of the things we did is we sponsored people into police academy. We paid for their way
Huge.
to go to police academy so that we could increase the diversity. Sorry to use that word. Increase the diversity in our police department.
But they had to really understand police officers, firefighters, because they're not in City Hall, they're remote. And they have opinions just like your guy about the piece of machinery. And very often in cities, they can be afraid that if they speak up, suddenly they'll find their position eliminated, or their promotion not accepted, or them not given the overtime opportunity. I've seen some cities where only a certain amount of people got the sweet overtime gigs. Or you have communities, one of the communities I work with has a large Haitian presence and not one Creole speaking officer. So we really have to make sure that we're working with our departments in concert with our cities and city administration. And that's something that we often overlook. Especially those remote departments like police and fire, and even the public works and utilities, where people don't come into a set space every day. You are completely reliant on that department director to make sure that the safety is felt out in those areas. And we have to be really careful to watch those areas.
Yeah, one of the things we learned quickly was that those mid-level managers affect the work experience of so many people, whether it's positively or negatively, that those were the people that we had to work on in terms of the training and development.
Yeah,
I
Jerry,
actually borrowed
I'm
from
sorry.
you, Jerry. Something that you created in the city of West Palm Beach. I don't know if I have Oakland Park on the call, but West Palm allowed us to borrow it from them when we replicated it in Oakland Park. And it's a mid-level management training for people who were just entering into lower mid-management or wanted to. And they call it City Smart in West Palm Beach. We called it Pop Smart in Oakland Park. And it really, it gives you a small group cohort of about 15 people. And we take them through everything from city policy to history of the city, to hiring, to interviewing. Because what happens with cities is we take people who have worked there a long time and figure, okay, it's time to promote them. And I once asked a department director, what do you tell your mid-level managers as you promote them? And he says, here's the keys, don't screw up. And that's pretty
happens everywhere.
much it in a lot of places.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Tony Bond, I see that you're on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. I'm sorry I'm late.
Tony is a colleague from Great Place to Work. Do you want to add anything to this discussion? It's so cool to have you on here.
Yeah, no, thanks for welcoming me. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I've had a chance to work with Jerry and the folks at West Palm Beach, and I love the conversation. And I totally agree. We started to look at the work that we do probably 5 years ago through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because as you know, we rank best companies to work for. We've been doing the ranking for almost 20 years. And what we noticed that within those organizations on our list, there was such a huge discrepancy in the experience across demographics. So we sort of changed our methodology so that we're actually recognizing companies that's doing a great job of making it a great place to work for everyone. And the results is unbelievable when you do have a great place to work for all. If you go back to the last recession and we look at our data and we figure out which companies rebounded the best from the last recession, it was those companies that had a very consistent experience across demographics. So basically creating a great place to work for all. So it does drive innovation. It drives organizational resilience. It drives growth in all different types of ways. And so I'm just glad and I'm excited to be a part of the conversation and have a chance to hear the discussion.
Well, thanks for
Tony, Tony, I have a question for you. This is Barbara.
Sure.
When you do that, when you look at people across demographics, how do you disaggregate for folks? How do you know when you get your results back who's responding? Do you have a way of telling that?
Yeah, when those surveys are set up, they're set up where we actually create various demographics. And so people are answering it, and it ties back to the various demographics. So we know all different people of color, women, how people consider themselves. That's how they take the survey. And so we disaggregate the data and look at it that way.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Sure.
And we found that so helpful to us in West Palm Beach as a jumping off point for discussion. How do we get better? We gave the survey again a year and a half later. We saw, very nice increases in our response. First of all, the first year we had 1,000 people take the survey. The second time we gave it, we had like 1,200 people take the survey. And, we saw an increase in trust level. We still had a ways to go, but it got better. It was helpful to have that structure. Bill, it looks like you want to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say earlier, but I think it's still quite relevant, is that I think one thing that you and I, Jerry, have discovered in the training work that we've done at Great Cities for All is one of the real untapped potential in organizations compared to how training seems to most often happen, and the approach that we've tried to adopt is that it seems that most of the focus is on what I'll call the upper or executive level, and in terms of leadership training, and to be able to work with the frontline people, and they are deserving and leaders in waiting in many respects. And so to be able to reach out and to work from bottom to top instead of from top to bottom necessarily, I think has been very effective for us. And it really goes a long ways towards engendering trust in the organization.
So I forgot to say earlier, but Bill Nugent is my colleague at Great Cities for All, and it's also his birthday today.
Oh, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Bill.
And I nearly blew a Zoom on my birthday. So.
That sounds much worse than you blew a Zoom, boy.
You know, when you talk about bottom-up training, we also have to have bottom-up communication. One of the most important pieces in your HR department is your employee relations department. I have seen employee relations departments just go completely amiss by not listening to staff, to that frontline staff. They say the customer's not always right. Well, the manager's not always right. And you have to give your frontline staff the freedom and the route. When I go in to talk about, for example, I do training on workplace bullying and harassment, and I talk about how to report. You'd be surprised, or you probably wouldn't be surprised, how much inter-work bullying and harassment happens and people are afraid to report because they don't know how to report up and they fear for their jobs. So they are afraid to report harassment, microaggressions, or anything that happens. So we have to look at how we manage employee relations so that we are relating to all employees, not just the top line employees. And that's absolutely a huge piece. And Jerry, I know that's something you worked on hard while you were there, being sure that office was an office that everybody felt safe walking into. And I think that's something we always have to look at. While we're training at that lower level, we have to allow that frontline level to be able to come in and say what they have to say.
So, it's 11 o'clock and we promised this would be over by then. If you have any questions, we could take maybe one or two more questions and or then we'll move on. Or any other questions?
Jerry, I also want to say that I'm just now in the chat for anybody and everybody who's interested. I've just put contact information for you and for Barbara in the chat. So anybody can go in there and.
Thank you. And we, as I said earlier, Great Cities for All is here to help. I tell everybody that the best job I had, and I was assistant superintendent of schools and a bunch of other stuff. The best job I ever had was being mayor of the city of West Palm Beach. And I love mayors, I love city officials, I love cities, I love governments because there's so much potential there. So if we can help you, we're here to help.